It all started innocently enough. 1967. Elvis complained of back pain after a stage accident during a Vegas rehearsal. Dr. George Nichopoulos, young, eager to help, honored to treat the king, wrote his first prescription, a mild painkiller. Nothing serious. Take 2 before bed, he said. You'll be fine in a week. But Elvis wasn't fine in a week. Or a month. Or ever again, because that first prescription opened a door that would never close. By 1970, the mild painkillers had become Dilaudid, one of the strongest opioids available. By 1973, Elvis was taking uppers to counteract the downers and downers to counteract the uppers. By 1977, his body was a chemistry experiment gone catastrophically wrong. Dr. Nick kept writing. Elvis kept swallowing. And then came August 15, 1977, the final prescription written for Elvis. Dilaudid, Demerol, Quaalude. Take as needed, Dr. Nick noted. Elvis thanked him, took the prescription, and returned to Graceland. The next morning at 2:30 a.m. everything would end. On August 16th, when his fiancée Ginger Alden found him unconscious on the bathroom floor, his body contained 14 different drugs. Ambulances were called. Resuscitation attempts failed. At 3:30 p.m. at Baptist Memorial Hospital, the king of rock and roll was pronounced dead. When Dr. Nick received the news at the hospital, he opened his prescription pad. He saw that final prescription, the one he had written just one day before. I killed him, he whispered. But was it that simple? From that first innocent prescription in 1967 to the final deadly one in 1977. A 10-year journey. Good intentions, terrible outcomes. An attempt to help brought destruction. This is the story of how a doctor's prescription pad became a death warrant and the tale of a decade-long chemical catastrophe. Part 1. The Doctor Who Said Yes, Doctor. George Nichopoulos was not a bad man. In fact, by all accounts, he was quite the opposite. A respected physician in Memphis, known for his dedication to patients and his willingness to make house calls at any hour. When he first met Elvis Presley in 1967, he saw not a superstar but a man in genuine pain. Elvis had injured his back during a rehearsal mishap, and the pain was interfering with his ability to perform. Can you help me? Elvis asked, his voice tinged with desperation. I have shows coming up. I can't let the fans down. Dr. Nick nodded. Of course he could help. That's what doctors did. He wrote a prescription for a mild analgesic, codeine, a common painkiller used for moderate pain. Take this for a week, he instructed. Rest when you can. The pain should subside. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from music history. Elvis took the prescription gratefully. For a few days it worked. The pain dulled just enough for him to get through rehearsals. But when the week ended, the pain returned. So Elvis called Dr. Nick again. I need more, he said. Just a little more until I'm fully healed. Dr. Nick hesitated. The medical guidelines were clear. Opioids should be used sparingly for short-term pain relief only. But this was Elvis Presley. The man had obligations, commitments, thousands of fans waiting. Surely a few more days of medication wouldn't hurt. He wrote another prescription, and then another, and another. By 1970, 3 years after that first prescription, Elvis was no longer taking codeine. It wasn't strong enough anymore. His tolerance had built up, his body demanding more powerful drugs to achieve the same relief. Dr. Nick upgraded him to Dilaudid, hydromorphone, an opioid 8 times more potent than morphine. It was reserved for severe pain, the kind experienced by cancer patients or those recovering from major surgery. Elvis wasn't recovering from surgery. He was performing 2 shows a night in Las Vegas, but the distinction didn't seem to matter. Elvis needed to function, and Dilaudid allowed him to do that. For a while. The problem with opioids is that they don't just kill pain, they rewire the brain. The receptors that once responded to natural endorphins now depend on external chemicals. Stop taking the drug and the body revolts. Withdrawal symptoms set in. Sweating, nausea, anxiety, unbearable pain. For someone like Elvis, who had to maintain a grueling performance schedule, withdrawal wasn't an option. So Dr. Nick kept prescribing. But now a new problem emerged. The Dilaudid made Elvis drowsy, lethargic, unable to summon the energy needed for high-octane performances. Fans expected the hip-swiveling, dynamic Elvis of the 1950s and 60s. They didn't want to see a man barely able to stand. The solution? Amphetamines. Dexedrine, to be specific, a powerful stimulant that would counteract the sedative effects of the opioids. Dr. Nick wrote the prescription. Elvis took the pills, and for a brief moment it seemed to work. He had energy on stage, charisma, presence. The pain was managed, the performance delivered. But now Elvis was caught in a vicious cycle. Uppers to get through the day, downers to sleep at night. More uppers the next morning to counteract the grogginess from the downers. More downers the next night to calm the jittery nerves from the uppers. His body was no longer his own. It was a chemical battlefield, and Dr. Nick was the general ordering the troops. In interviews years later, Dr. Nick would defend his actions. "I was trying to help him," he said. Elvis was in genuine pain. What was I supposed to do, let him suffer? It's a valid question. Chronic pain is real, debilitating, and for someone in Elvis's position, constantly performing, constantly under pressure, managing that pain was essential. But there's a line between pain management and enabling addiction. And somewhere between 1967 and 1977, Dr. Nick crossed it. The warning signs were there. Elvis's requests for medication became more frequent, more desperate. His tolerance continued to climb, requiring ever stronger doses. His behavior changed. Mood swings, paranoia, erratic decisions. Friends and family members voiced concerns. "He's taking too much," they said. "Someone needs to stop this." But who would stop it? Not Colonel Parker, who needed Elvis on stage to keep the money flowing. Not the entourage, whose livelihoods depended on Elvis's continued success. And certainly not Dr. Nick, who by now had become Elvis's personal physician, traveling with him, available at all hours, writing prescriptions on demand. The relationship between doctor and patient had shifted. It was no longer about medical care, it was about supply and demand. Elvis demanded relief, Dr. Nick supplied it, and everyone around them pretended this was normal. Part 2. The Prescription Epidemic in the 7 months between January and August 1977, Dr. George Nichopoulos wrote prescriptions for Elvis Presley totaling more than 10,000 doses of controlled substances. Let that number sink in for a moment. 10,000 doses in 7 months. That's an average of 47 pills per day. Nearly 2 pills every waking hour. The drugs included Dilaudid for pain, Demerol for pain, Percodan for pain, Dexedrine for energy, Biphetamine for energy, Quaalude for sleep, Placidil for sleep, Valium for anxiety, Amitel for sedation, and many, many more. This wasn't pain management. This was pharmaceutical Russian roulette. Every combination of drugs carried risks, interactions that could slow breathing, stop the heart, or cause seizures. And yet Dr. Nick continued writing. Why? To understand Dr. Nick's rationale, we must understand Elvis's Vegas years. From 1969 to 1976, Elvis performed 636 sold-out shows at the Las Vegas Hilton, sometimes 2 shows a night, for weeks at a stretch. The schedule was punishing. Wake up in the late afternoon, take pills to manage pain and boost energy, perform for thousands of screaming fans, return to the suite, take more pills to sleep, and repeat. Elvis's body couldn't sustain it. By the mid-1970s, he was suffering from multiple health issues: glaucoma, high blood pressure, an enlarged colon, liver damage, and chronic pain from old injuries. His weight fluctuated wildly. His face became bloated from medication and poor diet. He struggled to remember lyrics on stage. But the shows had to go on. Colonel Parker had booked them. Fans had bought tickets, and millions of dollars were at stake. Dr. Nick's job, as he saw it, was to keep Elvis functional. Not healthy, functional. There's a critical difference. A healthy Elvis would have stopped performing, checked into a rehabilitation facility, and spent months recovering. But a functional Elvis could take enough medication to numb the pain, boost his energy, and get through one more show. So Dr. Nick prescribed. And Elvis performed, and the cycle continued, each show taking a little more out of him, each prescription pushing his body a little closer to the edge. In early 1977, several people close to Elvis attempted to intervene. His father, Vernon Presley, confronted Dr. Nick directly. "You're giving him too much," Vernon said. "He's going to die if this continues." Dr. Nick's response was telling. "I'm managing his pain," he replied. "If I don't prescribe these medications, someone else will. At least with me, I can monitor him, control the dosages, make sure he doesn't hurt himself." It was the classic enabler's defense: better me than someone worse. And there was some truth to it. By the late 1970s, Elvis had access to multiple doctors, each unaware of what the others were prescribing. He could easily have obtained drugs from less scrupulous sources. At least Dr. Nick kept detailed records, knew what Elvis was taking, and in theory could prevent dangerous interactions. But the reality was darker. Dr. Nick wasn't just managing Elvis's care, he was facilitating his addiction. Every prescription written was another step deeper into dependency. Every as-needed notation was an invitation to abuse, and every refill request that went unchallenged was a missed opportunity to intervene. Friends like Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, members of Elvis's inner circle, tried to stage an intervention in 1976. They confronted Elvis about his drug use, begged him to seek help, warned him that he was killing himself. Elvis's response? He fired them. All three were dismissed, their years of loyalty erased in an instant. The message was clear. Anyone who challenged Elvis's access to drugs would be removed. Dr. Nick took note and continued prescribing. By the summer of 1977, Elvis's body was shutting down. His colon, ravaged by years of opioid-induced constipation, caused him constant agony. His liver, overworked from processing the chemical cocktail flowing through his veins, was failing. His heart, weakened by decades of stress and substance abuse, beat irregularly. He gained weight rapidly, at one point tipping the scales at nearly 260 pounds, yet suffered from malnutrition. Because the drugs suppressed his appetite and disrupted his digestion, sleep became impossible. Without medication, energy required stimulants. Calm demanded sedatives. Every natural bodily function had been replaced by a pill. Elvis Presley, at 42 years old, was pharmacologically dependent on at least a dozen different drugs just to get through a single day, and Dr. Nick kept prescribing. Because what else could he do? To stop prescribing would mean withdrawal, severe, potentially life-threatening withdrawal. Elvis would suffer through fever, vomiting, seizures, unbearable pain. He would be unable to perform, unable to function, possibly unable to survive the process. Quitting cold turkey wasn't an option, but neither was continuing. Dr. Nick was trapped in a prison of his own making. And so was Elvis Part 3. The autopsy report at approximately 2:30 p.m. on August 16, 1977. Ginger Alden walked into the bathroom of Elvis Presley's Graceland mansion and found him face down on the floor. He was still wearing his pajamas, black with a gold design. His face was pressed against the thick shag carpet. He wasn't breathing. "Elvis," she screamed, shaking him. No response. She ran to the phone and called downstairs for help. Within minutes, Elvis's personal aides rushed in Alstrada and Joe Esposito and began attempting CPR. Someone called 911. The ambulance arrived at 2:33 p.m. Paramedics found Elvis in full cardiac arrest. His skin was cold and mottled, signs that he had been dead for some time, possibly hours. They attempted resuscitation anyway, administering electric shocks, injecting adrenaline, manually pumping his chest. Nothing worked. At Baptist Memorial Hospital, doctors tried for another hour. At 3:30 p.m., Elvis Aaron Presley was officially pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. Dr. George Nichopoulos was at the hospital when the news came. He had been treating Elvis just the day before, had written that final prescription less than 24 hours ago. Now standing in the sterile hospital corridor, he heard the words no doctor ever wants to hear. He's gone. Dr. Nick's hands trembled as he picked up the phone to call Vernon Presley. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I did everything I could." But had he? That question would haunt him, and the world, for decades to come. The official autopsy was conducted by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner for Shelby County, Tennessee. What he found shocked even seasoned forensic pathologists. Elvis Presley's body contained traces of 14 different drugs. Codeine in significant amounts, morphine, Quaalude, Valium, Valmid, Placidyl, Demerol, Sinutab, Elavil, Avental, Carbital, Amital, Nembutal, and Butabarbital. Some of these drugs had been prescribed weeks earlier, some days earlier, some that very morning. The concentration of codeine in his bloodstream was 10 times the therapeutic level. enough to be fatal on its own. The combination of sedatives, barbiturates, and opioids created a synergistic effect, each drug amplifying the lethality of the others. Dr. Francisco's official cause of death: cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat. But the toxicology report told a different story. Elvis Presley didn't die of a heart attack in the traditional sense. His heart stopped because his body had been poisoned, slowly, methodically, over the course of a decade, by the very medications meant to help him. In the hours and days following Elvis's death, a curious thing happened. The narrative shifted. Dr. Francisco's public statement emphasized natural causes: heart disease, genetic predisposition, the toll of years of performing. He downplayed the drug findings, suggesting they were not significant factors in the death. Why the cover-up? Several theories emerged. Some believed the Presley family wanted to protect Elvis's legacy, to prevent his memory from being tarnished by the word overdose. Others suspected Colonel Parker's influence. A drug-related death would be bad for business, bad for the estate, bad for the merchandising empire Parker was already planning. Still others pointed to Dr. Nick himself. If the official cause of death was drug overdose, Dr. Nick would face immediate scrutiny. His medical license would be at risk. Criminal charges could follow. Better to emphasize the heart failure, minimize the drug findings, and move on. But the truth had a way of surfacing. Within weeks, investigative journalists obtained copies of the toxicology report. The headlines were damning. Elvis died of drug overdose. 14 drugs found in King's body. Doctor under investigation in Presley death. Dr. Nick, who had spent the days after Elvis's death in grief-stricken seclusion, suddenly found himself under siege. Reporters camped outside his home. Medical boards opened inquiries. Elvis's fans, millions of them, demanded answers. How could this have happened? Who was responsible? And why didn't anyone stop it? To fully understand Elvis's relationship with drugs, we must revisit a tragedy that occurred 35 minutes before he was born. On January 8, 1935, in a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, Gladys Presley gave birth to twin boys. The first, Jesse Garin, was stillborn. The second, Elvis Aaron, survived. Elvis grew up knowing he was supposed to be half of a whole. His mother told him, "Jesse gave you his strength. You're living for both of you." It was meant to be comforting, but it became a burden. Every achievement, every success was tinged with guilt. Why did I survive? Why not him? Throughout his life, Elvis spoke to Jesse in private moments. He visited the unmarked grave in Priceville Cemetery. He wondered aloud what Jesse would have been like, whether he would have been stronger, whether he would have handled fame better. The guilt never left him. Some psychologists who later analyzed Elvis's life suggested that his drug use was, in part, a form of self-medication for deep-seated survivors' guilt and depression. He wasn't just numbing physical pain, he was numbing emotional pain, the kind that no doctor could diagnose or treat. Dr. Nick prescribed for the body, but Elvis's wounds were in the soul, and so, on August 16, 1977, when Elvis's heart finally stopped, some wondered if he had been seeking this end all along, if after 42 years of living for two, he was finally ready to join Jesse. Part 4. The Trial of Dr. Nick, 3 years after Elvis's death. Dr. George Nichopoulos stood before the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners, facing charges of medical malpractice and overprescribing controlled substances. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Prescription records showing 10,000 doses in 7 months, testimony from pharmacists who had questioned his orders, statements from Elvis's friends and family describing the King's deteriorating condition. The prosecutor held up the prescription records, stacks of paper 3 feet high. "Dr. Nichopoulos," he said, "you prescribed Elvis Presley enough drugs to kill 10 men. Can you explain this?" Dr. Nick adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling. "I was trying to help him," he replied quietly. Elvis was in severe chronic pain. He had glaucoma, back injuries, colon problems. He was also under immense pressure to perform. My job was to manage his pain so he could function. Function? The prosecutor repeated. Or perform. It was a crucial distinction. If Dr. Nick was treating medical conditions, he was doing his job. But if he was medicating Elvis just enough to keep him on stage, to keep the money flowing, to keep Colonel Parker happy, then he was something else entirely, an enabler, a dealer in a white coat, a co-conspirator in Elvis's slow-motion suicide. The hearing lasted weeks. Witness after witness took the stand. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, testified that he had begged Dr. Nick to reduce Elvis's medications. "I told him my son was going to die," Vernon said, his voice shaking. He said he had it under control. Linda Thompson, Elvis's girlfriend from 1972 to 1976, described finding Elvis unconscious multiple times, surrounded by pill bottles. "I asked Dr. Nick to stop prescribing so much," she testified. He said Elvis would just get the drug somewhere else, and at least this way he could monitor him. But the most damning evidence came from the prescription records themselves. Between January 1975 and August 1977, just 31 months, Dr. Nick had written prescriptions for Elvis totaling over 19,000 doses of controlled substances. It wasn't just pain medication. It was amphetamines to wake up, sedatives to sleep, tranquilizers for anxiety, and opioids for pain. The sheer volume defied medical logic. Dr. Nick's defense attorney argued that his client had been placed in an impossible position. Elvis Presley was not an ordinary patient, he said. He was a global superstar under immense pressure, with access to unlimited resources. If Dr. Nichopoulos had refused to prescribe, Elvis would have found another doctor, or worse, turned to the black market. At least with Dr. Nick, there was medical supervision, monitoring, and documentation. It was the same argument Dr. Nick had used to justify his actions for years. And there was some truth to it. By the mid-1970s, Elvis had multiple doctors on call. Dr. Nick in Memphis, other physicians in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Palm Springs. He could easily have obtained drugs from any of them. In a perverse way, Dr. Nick's meticulous record-keeping may have actually prevented an even earlier overdose, but intent matters in medicine. The Hippocratic Oath requires doctors to first, do no harm. And while Dr. Nick may have believed he was helping Elvis function, the evidence suggested he was doing the opposite, enabling a lethal addiction, prescribing medications in combinations and dosages that no responsible physician would approve. The defense also pointed to Elvis's own role in his demise. Elvis Presley was not a child, the attorney argued. He was a grown man who made his own choices. He knew the risks. He demanded the medications. Dr. Nichopoulos tried to manage an unmanageable situation, but juries and medical boards don't tend to sympathize with that argument. Patients may demand drugs, but doctors are supposed to know better. They're supposed to say no. That's the power imbalance inherent in the doctor-patient relationship, and Dr. Nick, for all his good intentions, had failed to say no. In 1980, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners found Dr. George Nichopoulos guilty of overprescribing drugs to Elvis Presley and 9 other patients. His medical license was suspended for 3 months. It was a slap on the wrist compared to what many thought he deserved. But it sent a message. Even when treating celebrities, doctors are bound by the same ethical standards as everyone else. Dr. Nick returned to his practice after the suspension, but the damage was done. His reputation was destroyed. Patients abandoned him. Other doctors refused to associate with him. He became a pariah in the medical community, the doctor who killed Elvis Presley. In 1995, facing new charges of overprescribing to other patients, Dr. Nick's medical license was permanently revoked. He never practiced medicine again. In interviews over the years, he maintained his innocence, insisting he had only tried to help. "I loved Elvis like a brother," he said. "I would never have hurt him intentionally." But intent and outcome are two different things. Dr. Nick may have loved Elvis. He may have genuinely believed he was helping. But the prescription records don't lie. 10,000 doses in 7 months, 14 drugs in Elvis's system when he died, a medical license revoked, and a legacy forever tarnished. Elvis Presley's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a harbinger of a larger crisis. In the decades since 1977, prescription drug abuse has exploded into a full-blown epidemic. Opioids like OxyContin, Vicodin, and fentanyl have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. The very drugs meant to heal have become agents of destruction. Dr. Nick's case highlighted a troubling reality. The line between pain management and addiction is often blurry, easily crossed and difficult to retreat from. For doctors treating patients with chronic pain, The pressure to prescribe is immense. Patients are suffering, they demand relief, and pharmaceutical companies have spent decades assuring doctors that opioids are safe, effective, and non-addictive. We know now that those assurances were lies. Opioids are highly addictive. Tolerance builds rapidly, withdrawal is agonizing, and once dependency sets in, escaping it becomes nearly impossible without intensive treatment. Elvis Presley was one of the first high-profile victims of this epidemic, but he was far from the last. In the years since his death, we've lost Prince to fentanyl, Tom Petty to an accidental overdose, Michael Jackson to propofol administered by another doctor, and countless others, celebrities and ordinary people alike, to the same prescription drugs that killed the king. Dr. Nick became a cautionary tale. But the system that enabled him, a system that prioritizes performance over health, profit over people, and quick fixes over long-term care, remains largely intact. Part 5. The Legacy of the Pills. The debate over Elvis Presley's cause of death continues to this day. The official autopsy listed cardiac arrhythmia as the primary cause, with contributing factors including hypertension, coronary artery disease, and an enlarged heart. But the toxicology report painted a different picture, one of a man whose body had been systematically poisoned by prescription drugs. So, which was it? Did Elvis die of a heart attack or a drug overdose? The answer, most experts agree, is both. Elvis's heart was weakened by years of poor diet, lack of exercise, and the stress of constant performing. But the drugs accelerated the damage. Opioids suppress respiratory function, slowing breathing to dangerous levels. Barbiturates and sedatives further depress the central nervous system. Stimulants like amphetamines put additional strain on the cardiovascular system, increasing heart rate and blood pressure. The combination was lethal. Elvis's heart, already compromised, simply couldn't handle the chemical onslaught. On the morning of August 16, 1977, sitting on the toilet at Graceland, a common site for heart attacks, due to the strain of constipation, itself a side effect of opioid use, his heart stopped. He collapsed forward, his face pressing into the carpet, and never regained consciousness. It was, in the most literal sense, death by 1,000 pills. Dr. George Nichopoulos lived until 2016, passing away at the age of 88. In the nearly 4 decades between Elvis's death and his own, he never stopped defending his actions. In interviews, he insisted he had done his best in an impossible situation. "I tried to save him," he said repeatedly. "I tried." But privately, those who knew Dr. Nick said he was haunted by guilt. He dreamed of Elvis often, dreams where the king was still alive, still asking for just one more prescription. He would wake in a cold sweat, the weight of those 10,000 doses pressing down on him like a physical burden. In his later years, Dr. Nick became an advocate for stricter controls on prescription medications. He spoke at medical conferences, warning young doctors about the dangers of overprescribing. "Don't do what I did," he told them. "Don't let compassion become complicity." It was perhaps his attempt at redemption, a way to balance the scales, to save others from the fate that befell Elvis. But redemption is a complicated thing. Can a doctor who enabled a fatal addiction redeem himself by warning others not to make the same mistakes? Some said yes, that Dr. Nick's willingness to speak publicly about his failures took courage and could prevent future tragedies. Others said no, that no amount of advocacy could erase the fact that Elvis Presley died in part because of the prescriptions Dr. Nick wrote. Elvis's death had a devastating impact on his family, particularly his daughter, Lisa Marie Presley. Born in 1968, she was just 9 years old when her father died. She grew up in the shadow of his legacy, idolized by millions, but to her, he was simply Daddy, a man who loved her fiercely, but who was often absent, often medicated, often unreachable. In interviews later in life, Lisa Marie spoke candidly about her father's drug use. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "Even as a child, I could see it. The pills were always there. The doctors were always there. But no one talked about it. No one said the words addiction or overdose. It was always just, Daddy's not feeling well." Tragically, Lisa Marie would face her own struggles with prescription medication and substance abuse. In 2016, She checked into rehab, citing an addiction to opioids that began after surgery. The parallels to her father's story were heartbreaking. It seemed the cycle of addiction, enabled by well-meaning doctors, had repeated itself across generations. Lisa Marie passed away in January 2023, at the age of 54, from complications related to cardiac arrest. While her death was not directly attributed to drug overdose, her history of opioid use raised questions about long-term damage. The daughter of the king, like her father, had battled the same demons and paid a similar price. In the years since Elvis's death, the prescription drug crisis has only worsened. According to the CDC, more than 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses since 1999. Prescription painkillers like OxyContin, Vicodin, and fentanyl have devastated communities, torn families apart, and created a generation of addicts. The parallels to Elvis's story are impossible to ignore. Like Elvis, many of these victims started with a legitimate medical need: an injury, surgery, chronic pain. Like Elvis, they were prescribed powerful opioids by doctors who assured them the drugs were safe. Like Elvis, they developed tolerance, dependency, and ultimately addiction. And like Elvis, many of them died, not from the original pain, but from the drugs meant to treat it. Dr. Nick's case should have been a wake-up call, but instead the medical community and pharmaceutical industry doubled down. In the 1990s and early 2000s, companies like Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed opioids, downplaying addiction risks and encouraging doctors to prescribe them liberally. The result was a public health catastrophe. It wasn't until the mid-2010s, after tens of thousands of deaths, that regulators finally cracked down. Purdue Pharma faced lawsuits, executives were criminally charged, and prescribing guidelines were tightened. But the damage was done. Millions of Americans remain addicted to prescription opioids. Thousands more die every year. Elvis Presley was patient zero in a crisis that continues to this day. On the day before his death, Dr. Nick wrote Elvis's final prescription. It included Dilaudid, Demerol, and Quaalude, the same drugs that had sustained him for years, the same drugs that were killing him. "Take as needed," the prescription read. Elvis took the prescription, thanked Dr. Nick, and returned to Graceland. He spent the evening with Ginger Alden, played piano, talked about upcoming projects. Around midnight, he complained of insomnia, a chronic issue made worse by his irregular schedule and heavy medication use. He took some pills. Around 2 a.m., he went to the bathroom. He never came out. When Ginger found him hours later, the prescription bottles were still on the counter. Some were empty. Others were half full. The exact sequence of events, which pills he took, when he took them, how much was too much, remains unclear. But the outcome was certain. Elvis Presley, age 42, was dead. Dr. Nick received the news by phone. "He's gone," someone said. Dr. Nick sat in silence for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer, pulled out his prescription pad, and stared at it. The blank pages seemed to mock him. How many had he written? How many pills? How many warnings ignored? He closed the drawer. The prescriptions had stopped, but the questions would continue forever. Elvis Presley's death was ruled cardiac arrhythmia. But anyone who looked at the evidence knew the truth. He died from a decade of prescription drug abuse enabled by a doctor who couldn't say no. Dr. Nick wasn't evil. He wasn't malicious. He was a man who wanted to help, who believed he was managing an impossible situation, and who made a series of choices that ultimately killed his most famous patient. The tragedy of Dr. Nick is that he genuinely cared. In interviews, those who knew him described a compassionate physician who made house calls at 3 a.m., who sat with patients through difficult nights, who went above and beyond for those in need. His mistake wasn't cruelty, it was weakness. The inability to set boundaries, the inability to say, "No, Elvis, this is too much. This will kill you." And Elvis's tragedy was that he trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. He needed a doctor who would save him from himself. Instead, he got a doctor who gave him exactly what he wanted, right up until the moment his heart stopped. When researchers later compiled the full scope of Dr. Nick's prescriptions to Elvis, the numbers were staggering. 1967-1970, approximately 1,000 doses. 1971-1973, approximately 3,000 doses. 1974-1976, approximately 12,000 doses. January-August 1977, over 10,000 doses. Total, More than 26,000 doses of controlled substances prescribed over 10 years. That's an average of 7 pills per day, every day for a decade. But the distribution wasn't even. In the final months of his life, Elvis was taking upwards of 30 to 40 pills daily, a pharmaceutical cocktail that no human body could withstand indefinitely. Dr. Nick kept meticulous records of every prescription. In a perverse way, his documentation became his downfall, proof positive that he knew exactly what he was doing, exactly how much he was prescribing, and exactly how dangerous it had become. He couldn't claim ignorance. The evidence was in his own handwriting, on prescription pad after prescription pad, filed away in neat chronological order. On the evening before Elvis died, Dr. Nick spoke with him by phone. Elvis complained of trouble sleeping, of pain in his back and stomach, a feeling out of sorts. It was a conversation they'd had hundreds of times before. Dr. Nick's response was also familiar. Take the Quaalude for sleep, the Dilaudid for pain. Call me if it gets worse. It got worse. But Elvis never called. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. In the years after Elvis's death, Dr. Nick replayed that final conversation endlessly in his mind. Should he have insisted Elvis come to the hospital? Should he have driven to Graceland himself? Should he have cut off the prescriptions months or years earlier, despite knowing Elvis would simply find another source? The answers tormented him, because the truth was there were no good options. Elvis was trapped in a cycle of addiction that had been years in the making. Breaking that cycle would have required intensive rehabilitation, months away from performing, withdrawal that would have been agonizing and potentially dangerous, and Elvis was never going to agree to that. Neither was Colonel Parker. Neither were the millions of fans waiting for the next show. So Dr. Nick did what he had always done. He prescribed. He managed. He enabled. And on August 16, 1977, the inevitable finally happened. Today, Dr. Nick's prescription pad resides in a private collection, acquired at auction for an undisclosed sum. It's a strange artifact, a mundane medical tool that became a historical relic, tangible proof of how a well-meaning doctor facilitated the death of a legend. Collectors and historians debate its significance. Some see it as evidence of medical malpractice, a cautionary tale about the dangers of enabling addiction. Others see it as a symbol of the pressures faced by celebrity physicians, expected to keep stars functional at any cost. Still others see it as a mirror, reflecting society's own complicated relationship with drugs, pain, performance, and the price we're willing to pay for entertainment. But perhaps the prescription pad's greatest significance is this. It reminds us that addiction doesn't discriminate. Elvis Presley had money, fame, access to the best medical care in the world. None of it saved him, because addiction isn't about weakness of character or lack of resources. It's about chemistry, the way certain substances hijack the brain's reward system, creating a dependency that overrides logic, willpower, and self-preservation. Dr. Nick's prescriptions didn't create Elvis's addiction, but they fed it, sustained it, and ultimately made it lethal. Graceland, Elvis's Memphis home, is now one of the most visited private residences in America. More than 600,000 people tour it annually, walking through the rooms where Elvis lived, seeing his cars, his costumes, his gold records. They stand at his grave, located in the meditation garden on the property, and pay their respects to the king. But conspicuously absent from most of the official tours is any detailed discussion of how Elvis died. The narrative presented to visitors emphasizes his musical legacy, his impact on popular culture, his generosity and charisma. The drugs are mentioned obliquely, if at all. It's understandable. The Presley estate has a brand to protect, a legacy to preserve. But this sanitized version of history does a disservice to Elvis's memory. Because his story isn't just about talent and stardom. It's also about pain, addiction, and the failure of those around him to intervene. Telling the full story, including the role of Dr. Nick and the prescriptions that killed him, isn't disrespectful. It's honest. And it might save lives. In one of his final interviews before his death in 2016, Dr. George Nichopoulos was asked a simple question. If you could go back to 1967 and do it all over again, what would you do differently? Dr. Nick paused for a long time. Then he said, I would have said no. The first time Elvis asked for more pills, I should have said no. I should have told him, "This is dangerous. This will destroy you. I care about you too much to let this continue." But I didn't. I wanted to help. I wanted to be the doctor who could keep Elvis performing, who could manage the unmanageable. And in trying to help, I hurt him. I killed him. He wiped his eyes. I think about Elvis every day. I dream about him. I wonder what he would have accomplished if he'd lived, what music he would have made, what performances he would have given. He was only 42. He should have had decades left, and he would have if I'd been stronger, if I'd been a better doctor, if I'd loved him enough to disappoint him. It was, perhaps, the most honest admission Dr. Nick ever made, and the saddest. In the hours after Elvis's death, the medical examiner's office took photographs of his body during the autopsy. These images have never been publicly released, and likely never will be. But those who have seen them describe a heartbreaking scene. A man who looked far older than 42, his body bloated and damaged, the physical toll of years of abuse evident in every inch. One detail stands out in multiple accounts: Elvis's stomach contents. When the medical examiner opened his stomach, they found partially dissolved pills, lots of them. Some had barely begun to break down, suggesting Elvis had taken them shortly before his death. Others were almost fully dissolved, indicating they'd been taken hours earlier. It painted a picture of a man medicating around the clock, taking pills to wake up, pills to function, pills to sleep. A man whose existence had been reduced to a chemical routine, prescribed by a doctor who should have known better. The autopsy photos remain sealed, but the toxicology report is public record, and the truth is there in black and white. Elvis Presley's body contained 14 different drugs. He didn't die of natural causes. He died of the prescriptions Dr. Nick wrote. On August 15, 1977, Dr. George Nichopoulos wrote his final prescription for Elvis Presley. It included Dilaudid for pain, Demerol for additional pain relief, and Quaalude to help him sleep. 3 drugs, dozens of pills, and a notation that would haunt Dr. Nick for the rest of his life. Take as needed. Elvis took them as needed, and 24 hours later he was dead. The prescription didn't kill Elvis, not directly. It was the accumulation of years of prescriptions, tens of thousands of pills, a chemical dependency that had been building since 1967. But that final prescription was the last straw, the final dose that pushed Elvis's compromised body past the point of no return. Dr. Nick carried the weight of that prescription until his death in 2016. In his final years, he would sometimes take out his old prescription pad, the one from 1977, with Elvis's name on a dozen pages, and stare at it. "I tried to help," he would say to anyone who would listen. "I really tried, but trying isn't enough. Not in medicine. Not when lives are at stake." Dr. Nick tried to help Elvis Presley, and in the process he killed him. Elvis Presley's music lives on. His films are still watched. His influence on popular culture is undeniable. But his death, and the prescriptions that caused it, remain a cautionary tale. A reminder that even the king of rock and roll was mortal, that addiction doesn't discriminate, and that sometimes the people trying hardest to help are the ones who do the most harm. Dr. Nick's prescription pad is silent now, but the questions it raises echo through the decades. When does pain management become enabling? When does compassion become complicity? And when should a doctor say no, even if it means disappointing the patient? The answers aren't simple, but Elvis Presley's death proves that getting them wrong has consequences. Fatal ones. Rest in peace, Elvis Aaron Presley. January 8, 1935 to August 16, 1977. You deserved a doctor who would save you. Instead, you got one who couldn't let you go. And rest in peace, Dr. George Nichopoulos. September 29, 1927 to February 24, 2016. You meant well, but good intentions paved a road to Graceland's bathroom floor, where the king died surrounded by the pills you prescribed. The music endures. The legend lives on. But the prescriptions, those thousands of pills, scribbled on dozens of prescription pads over 10 years, tell a darker truth. Elvis Presley didn't die of a heart attack. He died of trust misplaced, boundaries unset, and a doctor who couldn't say no. The final prescription has been written. The pills have been taken, and the king is gone.